What we're talking about tonight is not directly about the war,
but it is related and can inform how we talk about the war
and what's happening in the world right now. So this is potentially a hot topic we're talking about tonight. I hope it will be a very hot topic. We are going to explore what it means to talk about
indigeneity and being indigenous
in the world in a broad sense, and also specifically in the sense related
to Torah
and what that might or might not mean. And the outcome of this is not going to be an answer, Jews are indigenous to the land of Canaan or Jews are not indigenous. It will be about what does it mean to talk about being indigenous to the land of Canaan. Because there are many different ways to think about indigeneity, and they don't add up to a single measurement of what is or is not indigenous. And it could be that one people measures indigenous according to a certain scale, and another people measures indigenous according to a different scale. There's a cluster of factors that indicate or that relate to our ideas about indigeneity. And it's not the usual case that you find all of those factors combined in one group or in one place. And what happens specifically in Israel, Palestine, Canaan, and in general, when I talk about that land, I'm always going to have in mind Canaan, Israel, Palestine, all of those, because there's not any time in the present where it's not, in some sense, all of those. And that's irrespective of borders. So it turns out that if you look at Palestinian people and the Jewish people, they measure indigenous on different scales. And so it's very easy for someone to go by one scale and say, well, this is the real indigenous people, and that's not, and vice versa. And we're not going to do any of that. So the thing I want to start out with is to get some ideas about what do you think indigenous means. And we're going to look at some of those different ideas. This is a funny little thing I'm already saying. But you know, it does relate to our topic, right? Because people make boundaries and other people erase them, and they draw new boundaries, and then other people erase those. And each people, each group, each political unit, which is sometimes the conqueror, and sometimes the people living there who are
resisting
being conquered, that draws its boundaries, thinks that those are the true boundaries. And that's the real state of
things.
I don't know if you've noticed, but you've heard the language, they want to wipe us off the map. Okay. Now, sometimes when people say they mean they want to commit a genocide against us, and I'm not saying who the us is and the they are, but if we were talking about literally wiping off the map, literally that's what we mean, then if you look at most maps of Palestine among free Palestine people, there's no Israel, it's all Palestine. And, however, if you look at maps put up by the Israel government, it's all Israel. Everyone wipes everyone off the map besides themselves. So forget that category. It doesn't matter. Let's be clear about this. You can apply the term indigenous to a group, a people, a person, a culture, a place, a religion, a set of laws, a civilization. What indigenous means in relation to each of those categories may also be different. So, give me any definition that you have for indigenous, and we're just going to collect this definitions right now. And when you say indigenous, what are you meaning? Are you meaning a people, a historical group? What's your idea about it? So, anyone, ideas about what indigenous means? Yes.
In terms of people who have been in an area prior to 10 human existence.
So, sort of like what we call first people, the first people to make their settlement, living, and civilization in a place.
Australia. Yeah.
Right. Also, sometimes the term Aboriginal is used to that. What other ideas?
Native to the land.
Yeah, native. Native, of course, is quite a fraught term, right? I mean, native can mean you're just born in a place. So, the word native can be used that way, but that's not what you mean, I know. Right.
And we have a comment here of the earth.
Of the earth. Yeah. So that's an important one. Of the earth does not describe where something enters into history. It only describes the relationship to the earth. So from that perspective, could you be the 10th people that arrive in a place, but the one that really makes the connection to the earth? So you're the indigenous ones. That's a question one could think about. All these hypotheticals are meant to get you to expand and me to have the most expanded idea of what indigenous could mean, so that we can then play with and explore what it does mean in reality, in our reality, in relation to this question. Yes.
So another two comments. One person is saying people are original to a place.
Right.
And then Raven is saying indigenous is living in committed relationship to a particular natural community.
Right. So committed to a particular, so of the earth, the earth is the entire planet, right? But he would say committed to a particular, other than use the word ecosystem does it shorter. But the word that, who was that?
That was Raven.
The word could be community.
So committed to the earth and committed to a particular ecosystem are not the same thing. But we tend, when we say committed to the earth, to mean committed to a particular place on earth. So often those to be used interchangeably. To go back to native for 1 second. So we say that someone is native born if they're born in this country. You're native born if you're born on American soil, according to our Constitution, according to these laws. But we also have the category Native Americans, which is entirely different. And so what we would say is that the word native is used in an anomalous fashion, where sometimes it applies in one way that doesn't make sense in another way. Yeah. And that's just a tricky part of language that makes this a more interesting or complicated topic. Did you want to say something?
I think of it sort of nebulously as living in a place where my ancestors lived.
Yeah, that's an important category.
But then when I think more about it, it's like, well, how far back does it have to go to then consider myself indigenous?
Which raises the question, which applies to many of these categories. How long do you need to be in a place before you count as indigenous? And I don't think anyone wants to propose a specific number of years, right? But we're talking about a certain kind of formation of culture. And how long does it take for that to happen? Right. So in theory, a very resilient and sensitive to the earth culture could indigenize itself in that sense to a new place very quickly, or it could take many centuries to indigenize itself. That's not the same as the category who was first here.
Well, when you were talking about laws or frameworks, what I was thinking about were ones based on stewardship of the land versus exploiting it for its resources.
Stewardship. And I'm going to add onto this, not having the idea of private property.
Right.
And it's one of the things that people identify, the idea of private property. So a bunch of these qualities are defining what is an indigenous culture. And they would become measurements where you look at a culture and say, does this look indigenous according to these qualities or values that we define as indigenous? And that may or may not work out in relation to this. Like there's a tendency to believe and understand that most original or earliest cultures were in a particular kind of harmony with the land that they lived on. And that is true for many of the indigenous cultures. We know that there were also cultures that started in places and ruined their ecosystems and disappeared and left an archaeological record. And they were the first people in that place. But they didn't find a way to live sustainably. Or maybe something radically changed in the ecosystem so that what was sustainable was no longer sustainable. That applies to Mesopotamia specifically. And that's important because that's where we say Abraham came from. So I want you to keep that in mind. This is plenty of definitions, but if someone wants to add more.
David?
Yes.
Could you repeat the thing you just said that was about
Abraham is from Mesopotamia, question, what does it mean to have that story? One of the things about that is the Mesopotamian civilization, starting with Sumer, went through several raisings of amazing civilizations that collapsed ecologically and were wiped out. Okay. So you can be a first people like Sumer was, and still, let's go to that example right now, actually, because this is very important to the full discussion of what the Torah is trying to tell us about what we think of as indigenous. So Abraham comes from Mesopotamia. Sumer is a few thousand years before Abraham could have come from Mesopotamia. But it's the early example of this civilization which built up in this river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates and then collapsed. There was Sumer first, and then that collapsed and that land was ruined. Then a new civilization started a little further up the Tigris-Euphrates valley, and that came up and it was ruined. And this happened like 4 different times. And so Sumer is the civilization that, as far as we know, invented the plow and writing. Rather important in human history. They wrote in cuneiform on the clay tablets with the things that looked like kind of little arrow marks. So we have some of the first writing from them because they made it on fired clay tablets which last. Maybe other civilizations were writing on other things that didn't last. But we know they had an important civilization that had a world-changing effect on everyone that came in contact with them. So what happened to them? How did you do agriculture in the Mesopotamian Valley? Is the Tigris and Euphrates both flow at levels higher than the valley itself, and the banks are higher than the rivers. And all you have to do if you want to water your valley land in between the rivers is you make a little channel opening, and then you can water, no problem. So it means that it's a civilization that is in control of its water, is in control of its agriculture, at least seems to be, and is therefore able to do all kinds of innovative things socially because they can rely on their food supply and they can rely on their land. They not have to worry about whether rain is falling or not. What happened, though, is that as you water from the rivers, the water table rises underneath the ground. And the water that's further underground, that was already underground, was not fresh water, but brackish and salted water. So as the water table rose, and they of course didn't know they were doing this, salt came closer and closer to the soil. And at first, they could no longer grow wheat. They had to switch to barley. And eventually they couldn't grow anything. And that was the end of the civilization. The greatest civilization, according to certain ways of thinking about it, that had existed in the world up until that point, on some level. There were other probably greatest civilizations that might have lived at that time. I'm not sure how the timing works in relation to the Americas, so I'm not making any particular claims about those
empires.
But Sumer destroyed itself. And the question here we would have is, when we say that Avram came from Mesopotamia, do we mean that our ancestor or ancestors came from a place where they knew about ecological collapse? And that's a question I want you to keep in mind when we start reading some passages in the Torah, which we're going to go to pretty soon. So in the Torah, we have river agricultures and economies. One is Mesopotamia, which isn't talked about specifically, but alluded to because that's where Avram comes from. What's the other one that everyone knows about?
Egypt.
Right? How does Egypt work? Does anyone have the... Hi. Thank you for coming. Egypt is a river agriculture. How does it work with the Nile? Anyone can say, but we have someone here who knows for sure. That's why it's... We're talking about how the river agriculture works versus rain-fed agriculture. Yeah. The Nile is flooded 3 times a year, and that's how it's be. And this is completely reliable, and it means that you do not have to worry about getting rain in order to farm. Period. This is partly why some of the best cotton in the world comes from Egypt, and there's several things that if you get them from Egypt, you're getting the best because of that reliability of that land. And it's not just that it overflows and gives water, but it overflows and brings silt and fertile ingredients, right? to nourish the soil, not just with water, but with actual minerals and such. So that's unique. Most cultures are a combination of rain and river fed. Some are strictly river fed. Sumer was, and Egypt is. We know of a case where that river fed agriculture completely collapsed in Mesopotamia. In Egypt, it didn't collapse, but we have stories about it collapsing, don't we? That's what our stories are. We have two stories of collapsing Egypt in terms of ecology. One is the Joseph story, the 7 years of sustenance followed by 7 years of famine. And the other kind of ecological collapse would be what? Slavery is a consequence of the famine.
Yeah.
That's social collapse that's caused by ecological collapse. Yeah.
Plagues.
Yes. The plagues, in this plague story that we have about Pharaoh and the plagues, is a story of plagues that, from a fairly obvious perspective, look like ecological unwinding, reversing the process of creation, and represent ecological collapse as well. So we have the society which is in famine, and because of the famine in our story, Joseph buys up all the grain during the 7 years of plenty, all the extra. He takes 1/5 every year for all 7 years, and then he has enough for the famine. Then when the famine comes, he he takes all their money to get grain so that they can plant, and he takes all their cattle, and they sell themselves as slaves, and they sell their land. So they end up, the entire Egyptian society in our story becomes enslaved because of how Joseph managed the famine. Now, we don't dwell on this often enough, but actually, the enslavement of the Hebrews in Egypt is a direct consequence of the fact that Joseph created a society that was completely relying on slavery and structured accordingly. So that to enslave the Hebrews was, nothing. It was no big shift. It was almost automatic for that to be able to happen. So that's an intense thing. We say that Joseph is a righteous person, and he's understood to be a righteous person in all of the Abrahamic traditions. But if he's a righteous person who created a kind of fascist slave state. So that's an odd kind of thing for a righteous person to do, unless you think he was ignorant of what he was doing, the same way that Sumer were ignorant of what they were doing and not understand it. But the Torah story is that if you have 7 years of plenty without giving the land rest, you will have 7 years of famine. If you have 7 years of famine and you don't respond correctly, you will have slavery. If you have slavery, you will become enslaved. If you become enslaved, the only way to release will be to destroy the society and collapse it through ecological disaster. And that's our story. That's our story about river-fed agriculture. So what's special about that is that people think in those kinds of ecosystems that they control the land. And we're talking about, now I'm not talking about this is true about those cultures essentially so, but that this is how our ancestors that wrote Torah understood those cultures. That they understood themselves to be in control of the land. That's how our story represents it. And that is what happened in Sumer, more or less. And they were not aware of the consequences of their actions. And they were not aware that there were limits to what they did. Sumer did more than just raise salt from the groundwater into the land so that it became poison for farming. They also, because they were so productive and culturally so rich and productive, they were able to bring wood from hundreds of miles away to build palaces in the middle of places where there were no significant trees to build it. Which means they denuded the slopes of the Anti-Lebanon mountain range on which fed the Tigris and Euphrates. So they actually changed the course of the rivers. They changed the level and destructiveness of the rivers when it flowed. They changed what happened when the rain came, because now rain falling on denuded slopes brings a lot of silt along with it, but not in the good way that the Nile does when it overflows. They did one more thing, which is they changed the rain patterns, because actually when air comes over a forest, it gets moistened and it actually creates rain clouds and creates rain that might not have been otherwise. So the rain patterns stopped a lot of rain, torrential rains, and then no rains. and the torrential rains wash away the slopes. And so that's looking very much like what we're thinking about when with the climate change. So it isn't clear yet. We're talking about us when we talk about these issues, and I don't mean because of the war in Gaza. I mean the climate change is at the extinction level that Sumer was. That's what we're talking about. So now let's get to the way people use the Torah to say the Jews are the first people. We own the land. God gave it to us. Where does that come from? That idea. I'm sure some of you will remember it. It's from God speaking to Avram in the book of Genesis. And God says, every place that you walk upon or every place that you see will be to you, you and your descendants forever. And it happens 3 times. So this is not like a minor event in Genesis. This is actually the major point. So people like to look at just those verses and ignore everything else. I don't know if you've seen the bumper sticker, which makes my blood boil. Israel, God's gift to the Jews. Okay, in case you didn't read any of the other Torah, the message of the Torah is that nobody owns the land. That thinking that you own the land is a desecration of the land and a desecration of what is holy and a violation against God. That's what the Torah says about thinking you own the land. So that bumper sticker is exactly the opposite of what the Torah teaches. But if you only read those 3 verses, you could get confused. Just like if you only read the first chapter of Genesis, you could think incorrectly that the story of the Torah is about humans conquering the land because of that one verse. People like to make their worldviews out of like a single verse. They like simple ways of manufacturing their understanding of the world. And that is disastrous no matter what principle you're doing it on. But in this particular case, the 2 principles, God gave land to us, or God gave the earth to humans to conquer, these are disastrous principles to build civilization on. These are, again, civilization-ending principles on which to base your lives. So here's where we want to take out a commercial, and I should have one for myself up here. So I'm going to have you turn to Chaye Sarah. And in this book is on page 127, it's chapter 23. So Sarah dies.
If at any point you want to share comments, so you can just sort of take a break and I can share.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm not.
Go ahead. This is a switching point. So, yeah, this is a good point.
There's some conversation in the chat about whether conquest, one person, I've lost their name because it's floated to the top, but one person says that any sort of conquest or harm to anyone or anything else that's there automatically in their mind negates the idea that a people can be indigenous. And then there's sort of this like other conversation about like, can you become naturalized? Can you become indigenous over time if you live on the land carefully?
Right. And I'm going to the answer is yes, in my opinion. There's debate about this. The answer is yes, in my opinion. It's the second question. The first question is actually a quite important question, which I have not dealt with in any of the times I've presented this before because no one asked it. So let's take a second to look at it before we go to the story. If our story says, Milu et ha'aretz v'kifshuha, fill the land and occupy her, is a more precise translation because it can mean both conquer but also not necessarily conquer. Fill the land and occupy her. And it also says to dominate all the animals. Right? So we have this idea of priority anthropocentrism in that verse very strongly. And of course, right before that, it says humans are made in the image of God, and it doesn't say that anything else is made in the image of God. And then the Torah proceeds to describe systems in which people own property and pay for it. And the story we're about to read is about Avram paying to buy some property. And there is definitely an idea that many indigenous cultures, and this is true about many, but not necessarily all indigenous cultures, don't have this idea of owning property, buying and selling it. Right? That's not part of indigenous, according to that way of looking at things. Now, I'm going to argue that that's not dispositive for the Torah being an indigenous tradition, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's go to the story. One more thing I want to say about that. If you notice, if you read the story carefully, and this requires you to read not just the first chapter, but the second and third chapter, which a lot of people don't bother with. You know, they want to read the simple thing and then forget about the rest. in the second and third chapter, it's not at all about humans conquering the land. It says 3 times that the purpose of the human is to serve the land. It's usually translated inaccurately as the humans' purpose is to work the land. It's not inaccurate in the sense that it means farming. It does mean farming, but the act of farming was understood to be an act of service and even worship of the land. The word la'avod means to serve, to worship. It doesn't mean to work, meaning to use for your work in this hierarchical sense. It's the exact opposite of hierarchy. But it does mean to farm. They understood farming to be a sacrament. They understood farming to be the purpose of humanity, but it was for the sake of the land, not for their own sake. And as I said, it says 3 times in those chapters and further on. 3 times the purpose of the human is to serve the land, avod etam adama. So what is interesting about those stories also is that the human is created in one place, and then it said God
Took
the human from there and put it in the Garden of
Eden.
So I don't know if you notice this. The human is not formed in the Garden of Eden, but placed there. So from the beginning, humans are not in the place they are born out of. They're not indigenous in that sense, right? They're not, Adam and Eve are not native to the Garden of Eden. They're native to some other place that they were taken from and put there. They were formed in one place, put in that place. So the idea of exile and not owning the land or not being indigenous to the land is already like at the very core of our very first stories. And then when they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden because of eating from the tree of knowing good and bad, where did they go? Does anyone know? Who didn't study this with me already? Because some people have. Where did they go after they left the Garden of Eden?
Meatball?
No.
Not the wilderness.
Where they were formed from.
Yep.
Nobody else was answering. It is true.
Do you all have the picture of that Renaissance painting of Adam and Eve like leaving the garden and they're like crying and sobbing and the angel's like,
Go.
get the F out of here. But that's not what the Torah said. The Torah does say that God drove the human out of the
Garden.
but then it says God put the human in the place that it was taken from. Asher l'kaf misham la'avodat ha'adamah. Asher l'kaf misham. That the human beings were taken and put back in the place that they were born out of so that they could serve that land. So there's this sense that there is a meaning to the place you're born out of, that it does have healing possibilities, a possibility of remaking and fixing the world by going back to where you're born out of. But notice that when they go back to the place that they're born out of, now they're in exile from the Garden of Eden. So no matter where you are, you're in exile for someplace else. So our tradition has an idea that somehow exile is an essential part of the human being. So what we do with that is interesting, and there are many possibilities, and I'll get to what I do with it, but you can do other things with it too. Make what you want out of that. Now we get to Avram's stories. So Avram's been told multiple times already that he owns the land, and we're on page 127. And now Sarah has died, and he wants to bury Sarah, right? So without looking at the words yet specifically, we're going to look at specific words. You know the story that he has this negotiation with Ephron Hitti, and they agree to a certain large amount of silver, and through that negotiation, Avram takes hold of the field of Machpelah and the cave that is in the field, and the cave is the burial cave. According to Midrash, and the Zohar elaborates on this, that cave is a secret passage to the Garden of Eden, speaking of exile and return from exile. Yeah, but that's not in the story. The story is just that it's a cave. We don't know why Avram thinks it's so special. That cave is a very holy site to Muslims and Christians and Jews. The Marat HaMachpelah, which is in Hebron. Hebron, by the way, comes from the word for friend. It's not the place of friendship
Currently.
but that's what it means. And by the way, the name of Avram in one of the names of poor Avram in Islam is Halil, which means friend of God. But we see here that he's also a friend of human beings. Because what does he say when he wants to buy the land? He could have said, I understand why militarily this might not have been viable, but he could have said, I want that cave and God already gave it to me. So, clear out. It's my kid. Right? He could have done that. That's what we think of when we talk about colonialism. This is not what he says. So he's been told multiple times by God, this is your land. This is what he says, right? Look at verse 3. Vayikomer Avram me'al meto. He got up from before the face of his dead one. And he spoke unto the children of Het, saying, this wording is very important. Ger b'toshav, a stranger and a sojourner, a temporary resident, am I, Anochi, with you, imachem. Please give me a holding of a grave with you, among you, and I will bury my dead from before me. And then they answer and they say, you're a prince among us, take whatever you want. They say, you belong here. He says, I don't belong here. He says, they said, I belong here. Take whatever place you want. And he says, no, I have to buy it. Because it has to be clear to everyone that you really gave it to me and that this was an honest taking. Right? So the first time that Avram wants to get land in the land of Canaan, it seems to be of utter importance to him that it happens through this very careful and honest negotiation. There's nothing about I own the land. There's nothing about God gave it to me. There's nothing about I'm in a covenant with God. It's only I am a stranger. I don't belong here. So I need your help. That language, which Ger b'toshav, is absolutely central to understanding what the Torah is saying. So who knows where the language Ger b'toshav comes elsewhere in the Torah? Don't say it if you know it. Just say who does know it. Who knows where Ger b'toshav comes? No one. I know Neely knows it. In Leviticus 25. What is Leviticus 25? It's the laws of the Jubilee year, the sabbatical year. Every 7 years, you have to let the land rest for an entire year. And that is what makes you belong to the land, is that you don't try to dominate the land. You don't try to use it up. That's why Egypt failed in our story of Egypt, is that they harvested for 7 full years. They didn't give the land a rest. Now, they didn't know from that. God didn't have given them any instruction to let the land rest. Joseph didn't have that instruction to give to Pharaoh either. But the story is representing the idea that if you keep taking from the land, it will fail. So you have to give the land a rest every 7th year. And in that year, nobody owns anything, and anyone can go into anyone's fields and take whatever they want, because no one owns anything. On the level of property, no property is owned. See, this is where the indigenous idea of being unowned, land being unowned, is brought into our culture. Is that nobody owns in that year, and you actually have to take down your fences because wild animals are also supposed to be able to go in and out of your fields to take whatever they want. So you're not just reverting to a state where humans don't own property, you're also reverting to a state where humans and animals share the same food, which is a description of the Garden of Eden. Humans and animals sharing the same food, going in and out among the same fields and orchards. That's what the Garden of Eden is. So every 7th year, we return to a state that's like the Garden of Eden, that's like being hunter-gatherers, that's like being a classless society where nobody owns land. And in the 7th year, all land transactions that have happened for the past 49 years are canceled. And everyone goes back to a land that they owned originally when it was equally distributed
between all the families.
Now, you might notice this could get tricky when people convert to Judaism or come into the civilization, because what land do they have? There was ways of working it out, which I'm not going to go into now. So just suffice for the moment, the idea of equitable land distribution is essential to this idea of the world. So when God says you can't sell the land, it says you can't sell the land
Latzmitut, to be cut off permanently,
because he Gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. You are strangers and temporary sojourners with me. Exactly the same language that Avram uses. He says, I am a ger v'toshav, and God tells us, you're gerim v'toshavim. That's Leviticus 25. I should have referred you to the actual text. I will give you the page number to set. chapter 25, verse 23.
Macher.
Oh, page 741. I'm sorry. That's much easier if the people then chapter and verse. 741, verse 23. And the rest is what I said. For the land is mine, you are strangers and sojourners by me. So Abraham is modeling for us what God tells us
About
how we need to see ourselves in that story. That language is very specific. There's another interesting clue about the Garden of Eden, by the way, in the Shemitah year. In the garden, it says God, the voice of God was mithalech in the garden. So normally the way you say going around is you say holech, mehalech, going, walking. It doesn't say, it says mithalech, walking itself. It occurs a very few number of times in the whole Torah. It occurs in the Garden of Eden, and it occurs in the description of what happens in the Shemitah year, in the society that observed the Shemitah year, that says, God, I will walk myself among you. So that's another clue that we're talking about a return to Eden. Remember, Eden, which is both a place of home and exile simultaneously. So similarly, our role in Palestine, Israel, Canaan, is to be simultaneously at home and in exile. To never say that we own the land. So it brings in the indigenous idea of not owning property, but in a way that is very built up on a lot of cultural ideas. It's not a simple idea of not owning the land. It's a complicated one. But our civilization is, meaning specifically Jewish civilization, is the civilization that tried to figure out how can we stay being tribal while fully entering into modernity. So yeah, we're complicated. Our culture is complicated. But it's not complicated about the idea that you don't take the land from people. No. You don't steal the land from people. At least not if we look at the stories of the fathers. Okay, what story do we have that completely contradicts what I just said? Joshua? Yeah. So we have all the Torah on one side, the rest of Tanakh on one side about how you should treat the land. And then we have the story in Joshua and some of the verses in Deuteronomy which say horrific things. That you should go into the land and kill everyone and then take it over. So it's like we have a schizophrenic Torah. And yeah, what's that? Just keep going. A Torah that has contradictory minds about itself that are not functioning in a coherent way with each other. Like, how about Moses? After Moses. That's strictly a Joshua task. Moses isn't allowed to go in, so that's all Joshua. Yeah, but Moses, Dafka, his story is you don't enter the land, and so that's a very different story. So here's a question that's interesting to think about: did they actually conquer the land? Is this a description of something that historically happened or not? Does anyone know the answer? The answer, as far as we can tell, and by we I mean archaeologists who I read about, and I don't do archaeology actually, but it's what I know about from reading other people who actually do know about archaeology. Most of the people who are not trying to prove the Bible is true, there's a whole coterie of archaeologists that's their thing, and then mostly Christian, we're going to prove that the Bible's true. Aside from those guys, nobody thinks there's evidence of a conquest. Of a conquest. There's no archaeological evidence of leaving Egypt. This is also true. Remember, the story in Egypt is that they're 40 years in the desert, and they're not wandering the whole time. They're like decades around a single mountain. It is inconceivable that could happen without leaving some archaeological record. And yet there's no such mountain, at least not as far as we know.
There's no evidence that the Shemitah of the...
We know that the Shemitah year was observed. We don't know about the Jubilee year, right? That 50th year when all land transactions are canceled and you go back to the beginning. Right. But then what we do know is the rabbi said if you don't follow Shemitah and Jubilee, that's why you go into exile. That the only way you don't get to go into exile, the only way that God doesn't force you to go into exile is if you treat the land like you don't own it, like you already have an internal exile running in your mind. But we don't own this. It doesn't belong to me. I can't do what I want. So that's the rest of the Torah, and then we have
Joshua.
So the Joshua piece doesn't have archaeological evidence that it happened, and even in the Torah itself, it's clearly not what happened, because all the stories later than that have Hittites and this group and that group are just intermingled with Israelite society, right? The big story about David and his big sin was Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba is the mother of Solomon. She is the lineage. But David has sex with her when she's married to Uriah, who is on the front lines in a battle. When he calls Uriah back and says, why don't you go hang out with your wife a little bit, so that it will look like Uriah slept with Bathsheba, so that David won't be known to have committed adultery. Uriah says, I'm not doing that. My comrades are in a battle. I'm not going to go do my wife in the middle of that. This is like not okay. So then David figures out, well, I'll just have him killed. So this is the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern moment, right? Except, of course, the Torah came first. That he has Uriah bring a letter to the head of the army saying, make sure you put Uriah in the front lines and that we pull back Canaan. So he gets killed. Now, if he was a Hittite, then the rule would be that you're supposed to kill him. That's the Torah. The part that I don't like, the part that I want to say is the same. That is in the Torah. But that's clearly not what they were doing. The people were intermingled. There's no criticism that Uriah was married to Bathsheba. He's a Hittite. He's married to Bathsheba. She becomes the father of the king of Judah. It's totally fine. The only not fine thing is that David sleeps with Bathsheba while she's married to Uriah, and that he causes Uriah to be killed. And it's the end of his kingship, essentially. I mean, from there on, he's essentially a failure. I mean, he's not a total failure because he gets his son to be on the throne, and Bathsheba manipulates it so that it's the son that she wants, which is her son, and the prophet Natan goes along with that. But in essence, that this idea of genocide, which is in the Torah, it's also in the Torah about the Midianites, who are even not Canaanites, but part of the Shemite lineage. It's clear that that's not what happened in the stories. What's that? Yes, Ruth is Moabite. Well, Moabite is not one of the 7 Canaanite nations. So it doesn't. So what's the other one coming up? The other genocide commandment? Amalek. Yeah, that's Purim. Today we started the month of Purim, and also the month of Ramadan. So that happens every, 13 years. More than that if we're talking about the second Adar coinciding with Ramadan, because the second Adar, it coincides with Ramadan. We have a story of genocide. No, it's not literal. It's not exactly correct. We have a story of tens of thousands of people plotting to kill the Jews when Haman arranges this whole thing. And by the way, the Book of Esther is the first time the word Jews is used as a description of the people. And instead the tables get reversed, and they get reversed literally, so that instead of the tens of thousands of people killing the Jews kill the tens of thousands of people that wanted to kill them. So it's not technically a genocide because all those people are not necessarily from a single people, but they're all in some ways followers of Haman. Right? So it has, right now, arguments rage about where and when the word genocide can be used. Where and when and under which situation we use the term genocide, which I'm not going to enter into. But I think it's an important conversation, but maybe not so important, because the question is not is something fitting this label or not, but whether it's right or not. And that's not dependent on whether it fits a particular label or not, right? I'm trying not to do politics explicitly, but I think you understand what I'm saying. So we have this story of Amalekite. That's the other genocide story. So basically we have 3. We have the Canaanite Asians, the Midianites, and the Amalekites. And the only one where there's a story that consistently says that we actually did a genocide, even though it's kind of fabulistic and
The Book of Esther.
kind of a parody. We have in Shmuel that Shmuel, King Saul, the king before David, kills all of the Amalekites except the king and some sheep he saves. And because of that, he loses the kingdom. So in that story, if you don't commit a complete genocide, you lose the kingdom, as opposed to the story in David, that thing where they're not how dare you kill a Hittite who's part of your court. So we have a contradictory legacy there. And the way I've begun to think about more and more is that we have actually two Torahs, and one of them we need to spurn, and the other we need to accept. And spurn is not quite the right term, because what do we want to learn? Yes, we have to learn from it. It's also true that Joshua was like the
Worst written book.
It just is. I mean, just into the literary qualities. That's obviously a personal
Opinion. Not an objective opinion.
So that's a big picture about what the Torah says about owning land. And whether yes. Mm-hmm.
So everybody's no comments.
Okay.
It's just listening. So I'm just still stuck on Abraham from a while back. So yes, Abraham buys the cave, but doesn't Abraham also get into land disputes with people and well disputes with people?
Abraham doesn't.
Particularly.
It says that Isaac redug the wells of his father, which implies that the Philistines, who are not the Palestinians, mind you, it's where the word Palestine comes from, but it's not. There's not a cultural continuity there. Right? There's more continuity between the Jewish people and the Palestinians.
Abraham, wells.
Well, Isaac. He says Isaac redug the wells, and when he redigs them, there's fighting between him and the Philistines.
Servants.
Right. Until he finally. So what does he do, by the way? When there's fighting over a well between him and the Philistines, does he fight or does he create a war? Does he try to take it? No, he moves. So I'll try a different well. This one didn't work. I'm going to call it Stripes. Sitna. That's the name of that well. This one didn't work. The third well, nobody argues over. So he says, finally we have enough room in the land. I'll call this one I'll call this one the wide well, because God has given us enough space to be in the land together with the Philistines who supposedly we're going to take the land from. So that's a story. Also, all the stories that they're about, except for one, are stories where the ancestors, when they're confronted with a fight over land, retract and say, we're not going to push this into a conflict. We're going to step back and let there be space for the other people. Every single time, except one. What's the other? What time where it doesn't work out that way? Shem. Shem is Nablus, by the way. Roughly, in modern. In the story of Shem the prince, who's I guess dad named the town after his son or something like that. Dinah, Jacob's daughter, goes out to see the daughters of the land, as it says, and then Shechem sees her, likes her. It says humiliates her or humbles her, which is understood generally to mean raped her. But then it says that he loved her. And he went to Jacob to beg to let him marry Dinah. And if depending on whether you look at the Red 10 version or other versions, in some versions, Dinah ended up loving Shem also, and maybe it wasn't rape, except in the sense that it wasn't supposed to happen. It's unclear. What happens is that Jacob's like out of the picture. He's not doing what he's supposed to do, which is being a father properly controlling his sons from doing things that are genocidal. They say, you have to circumcise yourselves, and then you can marry Dinah. So they circumcise themselves, and then only two of them, Shimon and Levi, go in and kill everyone, all the males, when they're in pain from the circumcision and they can't fight back. And when they do this, Jacob is furious, but he doesn't say, I'm mad at you because you did something wrong. He says, I'm mad at you because you made me stink to the inhabitants of the land. He doesn't say you did something wrong. That's a problem. That's a problem for the claim I'm making. Except we don't know what he really thinks until he's on his deathbed. So basically, at the time, they're so ferocious and violent that he is afraid to confront them. And on his deathbed, he says, you are full of violence. I'm going to divide you in Israel. You get no inheritance. You get no part in the land. You can't have the land because you control things through violence. So that also fits the message. It's just that it takes his whole lifetime before he has enough courage to say to Shimon and Levi what he really thinks, which tells you how scary they were. Okay, that's the avot, the imahot, the stories of the ancestors. I want to go to a different subject now, unless you want to say something first.
I'm just trying to understand this vision that you're building of Abraham. Like, you're imagining Abraham, God says, Abraham, go to this land, it's yours, I give it to you 3 times. And Abraham has some like nomadic, non-ownership relationship with this land.
Meaning?
I just want to make sure that's what you said. Thanks.
Nomad could have more precise definition. He gets super rich because cattle reproduce and make more cattle, or sheep reproduce and make more sheep. Just as an aside, the Torah says when someone's been a servant to you for 6 years and they leave, you have to give them from everything that God has blessed you with. And the Talmud says that means sheep and wine and oil and things like that, like stuff that is blessed, but not money, because money is not blessed. And why is money not blessed? Because all the other things grow naturally, because they're biological processes and they grow. But money, because it can't do that, is not blessed. Now, in that society, you weren't allowed to charge interest. That's true of Islam and
Judaism.
You're not allowed to charge interest. So in that case, maybe you would have a society where money didn't grow. In our society, we think of money as the ultimate blessed thing that always grows, right? Everyone wants money because it invested in it will grow. Everyone wants sheep. The sheep actually will grow, and they'll make more sheep, but nobody wants sheep. What can I say? But that's also that's a more, I'm not going to say indigenous, that's a more indigenous way of thinking about property. Like, what is blessed is things that can grow naturally because they're part of the cycle of
Living.
and the processes of nature, which money is not. Okay. This brings us actually to the topic I want to get to, which is, in what ways, or what might we mean if we want to say that the Torah is indigenous to Canaan, Israel, Palestine? Because we've already talked about some of the things that make a culture indigenous, and what I want to say is, I want to focus especially on the ideas of stewardship committed to a particular ecosystem of the earth. If you look at the rituals, the laws, the customs, the theology, everything about what the Torah teaches, it fits the definition of a culture that clearly evolved in a particular land according to the rules of a particular ecosystem and does not make sense fully anywhere except in that ecosystem. So obviously one way is the way that the 3 pilgrimage festivals fit the harvest, right? So Sukkot is precisely when the rainy season begins and when the fruit harvest ends. Passover is precisely when the rainy season ends and the barley harvest begins, and then the wheat harvest, and then the wheat's growing, and Shavuot is precisely when the wheat is harvested and when the first fruits begin. So the juncture of the holidays is always at a place where there's an end of one kind of harvest or giving and then the beginning of a new kind of harvest. So that's because that ecosystem fits those holidays. That's why. It doesn't work anywhere else in the world. It might work not badly in California, actually. But it doesn't work precisely in any place else in the world. There are many, many things like this. So, for example, cloven hoofs and chewing cud. Why are those the only mammals we need? If anyone has heard me talk about this, you know my answer already, but does anyone know or have a theory why the mammals the only land animals, mammals or otherwise, have to chew cud and have split hoofs? And obviously they're mammals, so they could know. Ideas?
Well, I can imagine that those were the mammals that were available, like in rocky terrains, like sheep and goats. And animals named. Yeah, I know they're like the animals of that place.
Yes, but
Not quite. First of all, we know that some of the cultures there had pigs and used pigs quite a bit. And then there were animals that don't fit in that category. Now, camels are a late addition to that area, but they're certainly after the Torah.
PN says that they think it's because those animals keep the land fertile.
Does she have more specifics about that?
But I'm assuming it's the right cloven hoof earth relationship that the permaculture people talk.
Right, permaculture people talk about how if you graze the right animals, it actually doesn't pack down the soil, but makes it more aerated and more fertile. And so specifically, chewing cud means you eat food that people cannot eat. Grass. We cannot eat grass. You can also eat food that people do eat, grain.
Especially wheat, since barley was often seen as animal feed. Wheat is
Not how you feed your animals. We're living in that kind of society, right? And split hoof means you can graze on rocky and hilly soil, which you can't farm easily. So that the animals you raise are not competing with you for food or for land. Now, there are other ways to structurally build a society that's ecologically sustainable. There were Canaanite cultures before the Israelite culture, which in some ways is a Canaanite culture that's just different from the other ones. For example, that was an important part. But for our ancestors who had these rules, they only wanted to be in that kind of relationship with animals that did not compete. And they understood themselves to be in a covenant with those animals. So you know how we always say God's our shepherd? So one thing we don't mean is God is the one who will kill us and use our fleece to
cover car seat.
That's not what we mean when we say God is our shepherd. So why do we say God is our shepherd? They knew more than any of us know about how the shepherds kill their sheep. So we know God gives us life. So of course God takes our lives as in the same way that God gives us life. When we say God is our shepherd, we intend, or they intended, I don't know what we intend. They intended, yes, God also will kill us in a good way. The idea is the responsibility of the shepherd is to give the sheep a good life and a good death. And that's the covenant that the shepherd has with the sheep. So protect them from being torn up by wild beasts, kill them if they get sick.
And won't recover.
And then when you give them death, we have a lot of rules about how to give a good death
To an animal.
We have a lot of rules about that. And a lot of them have to do with respecting the idea of life itself, which is understood by our tradition to be the blood itself. All of it is about respecting the blood. For animals that are not domesticated, where you are actually taking their lives and you didn't give them life. So in a way, you don't have the right to take their lives. You have to actually bury the blood because it's like burying a person. You give them a burial. With domesticated animals, because you're giving them life and taking life from them, you don't have to bury the blood. So you see, these are all very precise and fit the hilly, rocky land of Canaan. There's many, many, many other examples, but those are two good ones. Now I want to go to Deuteronomy. What time is it?
8:09.
That seems pretty good, actually. We're on track. And we're going to look at the verses that come right before the second paragraph of the Shema. Page 1051, Parshat Ekel, 11:10, verse 10. So in this section, and this is Moses giving a very, 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 very long speech to the children of Israel. He's talking about the commandments that we need to follow when we go into the land. And then it starts describing the land. So this is verse 10. For the land where you are coming there to inherit her is not like the land of Egypt, Asher Yitzata Misham, which you came out from there, where you sow your seed and water with your foot, like a green garden. We're going to need to analyze that in a second. So let's get the next verse. The land where you are crossing over there to inherit her is a land of hills and valleys. From the rain of the heavens she drinks water. She is a land that Adonai seeks after continually. The eyes of Adonai are on her from the beginning of the year until the end of the year. And then what follows is the second paragraph of the Shema, which you recite, if you're being traditional, observant Jewish, you recite every single day, twice a day. Not the one that everyone knows, V'ahavta, but the second paragraph, which the Reform movement took out, because what does it say? It says, if you follow the laws, you will get rain in its season. And if you don't, you won't. And you'll get lost from off the land. And the Reform movement said, this is superstitious. We don't like it.
Are they going to put it back?
They were almost going to put it back, and then it got mixed. In the most recent Siddur, there was big debate. Unfortunately, the good guys didn't win. Or not really the good. The guys I agree with theologically. Anyway, what is it saying here? Okay, it's not like the land of Egypt. It's not a river ecology. It's a mountain rain ecology. That's very explicit. we're contrasting a river ecology
with a
rain ecology, rain-based agriculture.
Well, I'm kind of hearing that God controls the rain, but I guess not the river. The river just naturally watered the land, but you're going to a land where you have to stick to the covenant, and then I'll make sure it rains.
The thing about rivers is like how the river flows and what happens to it isn't dependent on you. It depends on what's upstream from you, possibly hundreds and hundreds of miles. So you think you have control over it because you can take
from the river
wherever you want, although you actually don't have control of it, but people don't understand the ecology at that level most of the time. And so they think they have control over it. It's the illusion of control which is the danger, according to the way our ancestors thought about it. So it's a rain-fed agriculture, not a river agriculture. One of the things to note, and I don't think they knew this literally in a scientific sense, but a rain-fed agriculture you can't get soil becoming salinized so that it no longer works for farming. Because the rain's coming fresh without salt from the heavens and raining down and flowing through. So any salt is going to get washed away. Right? So that's something they didn't know explicitly, but is implicit in what they're saying. So what does it mean to water your seed like a vegetable garden or like a green garden with your foot? What does it mean to water with your foot?
You have to carry it.
No, you don't. I've heard other ways of explaining this. They all mean the same thing, which is you basically don't have to do much to water your full field. The way that I remember when I think about it is that because the land is very flat next to the Nile, please correct me if I say anything incorrect, you can raise the water just a little amount and still be able to send it pretty far into your fields because it's so flat along both sides of the Nile. And so you do not have to work very hard to water your field. In the same way in Sumer, you just had to make a little channel in the bank of the river and you could water your field. You didn't have to do much. You had to do even less in the case of Sumer, but in the case of Egypt, you can use a kind of foot pedal system to just raise the water a little bit and water the whole field. There's no rivers big enough to do that in most of Canaan. The Jordan River is not a big river, despite fundamentalist Christian fantasies about it. It's not chilly and wide. And not only that, it's much less chilly and wide because everyone around there takes so much water from it, it's almost destroyed as a river. They keep a certain amount going up until where the Christians like to go to get baptized. And then right after that, they take all the water out. It's a disaster, and it's a disaster for the Dead Sea. It's killing the Dead Sea. Right? But in general, there's not any place to bring the water up from in order to raise the water at the top of the hill, and that's not how you can't do that. It's too much. It's unsupportable work. To try to bring the water up like that, and you don't have water at the base to bring it up. In general, water is a very precious resource, and the way you deal with that is you build cisterns, right? You hollow out the limestone so that water can fill it when the rain comes. So then that's how you store water. And you do that near the top of your hills on the bottom, because then you can take the water out of it and have it flow down. And what do you do with the rain so that it doesn't just wash off the side? What do you do to the land on the hills? Terracing, right? Terracing. That is indigenous agriculture for Canaan. That's not indigenous agriculture for a place that's not hilly. That's what makes sense in Canaan. That's what our ancestors did. And who else does that? The Palestinians. That's how they farm, right? They do that. They do what is by definition indigenous agriculture, using terraces that have been there in some cases for thousands of years. What does it mean to say the eyes of God are on the land continually from the beginning of the year to the end of the year? One way you might read that is to think God really is going to be close to you and loving you and taking care of you. And that's not at all what it means. What it means is God's watching you, and if you step out of line, you're not going to get rain. So the basic message of that paragraph that you read is, it's not like Egypt where you had control over your agricultural destiny and you could water your plants. The place you're going to is a place where you can have a famine in like a month's time and all die. And that's where we want to go.
Let's
do it. So why did our ancestors think that? What's that?
You'll only get rain if you keep the commandments. This is something totally out of your control. So you have to put aside to a supernatural.
Right. And the reform movement doesn't like that because they don't like supernatural meteorology. But in climate change times, we know that there's actually enough truth to that it's true, that it is true, right? It's just a much longer process, but it's true. So regardless of whether we want to look at that as superstitious the way the reform movement did or true the way I, as someone who cares about ecology, does, what it does mean is you have no control over your destiny and you might be killed off in a famine any time. And that's what our ancestors wanted. So why did they want that? Just guess, imagine. That would never be in a brochure put out by a town in America. Move to Las Vegas where you can run out of water and die as soon as the Colorado River stops running.
I'm not convinced they want it. I mean, I believe that is where they were, and that I believe that is how they found their relationship with the divine. But why are we saying they wanted it?
Well, the paragraph we read seems to think they say that they want it. It's not going to be like
Egypt. It's a place.
God is watching you continue from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Sounds like a positive. I
think
it's debatable for sure.
Like maybe they look at it as positive because they don't have a choice because that's where they're stuck. So they have to turn it into a positive. That's one way to look at it.
But I'm confused about how they don't have a choice because God's saying if you do these things, like if you obey these.
No, they can't control whether rain comes down or in directions. God controls it, and they can respond to God in a way that God looks with favor upon them.
But Caroline is right. It's about, if it's about your actions, then they have control. They just have to control their actions.
Yeah, that's another way to look at it. There's nothing wrong with that. But in that case, then they want a place where the morality and justice of their actions, something that has a direct response from God. If you look at it that way, still, it kind of fits what I'm saying, which is what they wanted is an intimacy with God where they could count on getting very quick feedback on whether they were doing the right thing or not. And where they would know right away whether they were doing justice or not.
What they believed is that that's what they had.
Yes, that's what they thought they had.
But just taking out the want or need of it, that's how they understood the world to work. That's how they understood their relationship with the divine to work, because that they had this immediate feedback.
Yes, but I think it's right, but it's fine to disagree about it. But I think it's right to say that the Torah is presenting that as a really great thing.
I think the Torah is saying that's a really great thing.
I think what's coming to mind for me is that it's so that people don't sort of become entitled. Like,
yes,
like with the river, this river's there for me. I can draw water at any time and water my fields and grow food. It's sort of, no, I have to maintain. I have to obey these main things, right? And stay in line. It's never. I just don't just inherit this,
right,
privilege,
right. So the first promise is the promise that you will get the land made to the ancestors. But the second promise is, and if you don't do justice, you don't get to stay there.
Right.
That is essential to the covenant and essential to what we might call the indigenous wisdom of our ancestors. Is that if you're doing justice, you will get thrown out of the land. Not every people believe that. A lot of people thought their tenancy in the land was dependent on whether they did the proper worship of the gods, made the right sacrifices and offerings. Even though the Torah has all kinds of sacrifices and offerings, at no point does it say that your tenancy in the land depends on doing that. It's just very explicit. There are things that depends on is how you treat the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. 1. Do you let the land rest and have a shida? 2. That's pretty much what gets picked out of the land. There's a few sexual sins which seem to be highlighted, although they're not as primary as the one just mentioned. You don't worship idols. Yes, and that's the third one, not to worship idols. So those 3 things. And what does it mean to not worship
idols?
Just a quick thought about this. Our ancestors understood that God was, so to speak, invisible. Like the way you knew God is by watching the wind. The wind was the perfect paradigm for God because it was invisible and yet moved things. And so when you try to make it physical, you totally misunderstand what that is, that the invisible animates what's visible. And that was at the core of our ancestors.
Were all these to some of these pagan rites.
Right. And I don't want to say paganism is so terrible. And that, I mean, I don't know enough about Canaanite culture. I did want to mention, like, if there was no conquest, then that means that the Israelites were Canaanites who came up with the whole idea. Right? Not a separate people necessarily. Just to be clear about the picture. So the picture we have is that the Jewish people, more like the Hebrews or the Israelites, are not indigenous to Canaan because Aram comes from Mesopotamia. Jacob goes to Padan Aram, where his entire family is born, except Benjamin. They go down to Egypt, and they become a people in Egypt, or in the process of leaving Egypt, depending on how you look at it, or in the Sinai Desert, or some combination thereof. They don't become a people in the land. The family isn't born in the land. The family doesn't come from the land. So the Torah keeps telling us they're not indigenous, but it's very clear from the rules that the Torah itself is indigenous to Canaan. It's not another way to interpret it. It's clearly indigenous to that ecosystem. So why did the Torah that was clearly indigenous to that ecosystem want to tell a story which said that its people was not indigenous? Yes, go.
So GN says, I am thinking of it in a way as if even when you're not being watched, small wrong choices add up over time in response to this, like, feedback loop with that. And
that's good.
Yeah, and Stephen says it seems to be about our modern notion of reciprocity. This feedback loop.
That's a good way to look at it now. I mean, there's many frameworks we can use, but that's a fine one. So that's the question still to be resolved. Why did our ancestors want to think of themselves as not indigenous if they were? If they were actually Canaanites with a new idea, why did they want to say they weren't? One possible answer, which I want to reject, but I want to say it is possible, is that they wanted to tell a story about how they conquered the land to make them more strong and tough. But now let's look at other possibilities. Oh, Matthew had his hand up, and then I can't see who that is. Diane. And I don't know yet. What's it? Addie. Okay, so Matthew, Diane, Addie.
Well, this is not particularly theologically interesting answer to your question, but isn't it possible that the people who constituted what became Israelite identity were some combination of Canaanite and immigrants?
Yes, there's a strong hypothesis. I don't know how to validate it or not, that there was a smallish group of people that might have come up from Egypt or might have been wanderers or people that were lower class, actually, and cast out in some sense. And some people identified it with the Abiru or Hapiru, which they think could be related to Hebrew. And so then it was like some kind of a confederation, as it were, right? Between some people that came from the outside who had this really cool idea and some people who were Canaanite, and they got together and said, yes, we're going to be any people
together.
That's possible.
They also may have done differentiate themselves and people.
Right. They say this is really a new culture. So we're going to make up a story that says we came from someplace else. Yeah.
I'm going to say in the wise word of my 4-year-old when I give her a command, I am not, she says, I am not you and you are not me. Looks like that has to build a relationship with her. Perhaps to get to do what I want. Indeed, that they're separate in a way, and you have to be in this relationship that is ebbing flowing, and it has to be built in.
Yeah. So those are all good thoughts, and there are many possible good thoughts. Yeah. Oh, Josh.
Just the story about Abraham. Yeah. Then the story of Egypt. There's movement back and forth, so it's not surprising that people were familiar with different kinds of ecosystems who came from more than like agricultural based civilizations. You might embrace a certain kind of different kind of ecology with the knowledge of others as well.
Yes, and then the New Yorkers come in and impose their culture on the
rest of us.
COVID New Yorkers who came up to us. But yes, for sure.
There certainly seems to be a fair bit of wandering from the very beginning. right? Like we think of wandering after the exile, but there's a lot of wandering.
Well, and remember, and I was saying the core story is about how there's a place you were born from and a place you're put in, and you're never in harmony in both places at once because they're two different places. And so you're always in some kind of exile in relation to something, right? And that seems to be core to our ancestors' identity about what it meant for them to be human and in the world and in relation to God. So what does it mean? It means that you see yourself as strangers. And what are the two big commandments that have to do with being strangers? Love the stranger, because the stranger is like you because you were strangers in Egypt. And you know the soul of the stranger. So that's a foundation of ethics of the Israelites. And the other thing about being a stranger is what? The Shita, right? You don't own the land. So at the core, at the very most central principles and foundation of our ethics in our tradition is that you need to think of yourself as strangers in relation to other people so that you treat them good even if they're strangers to you. And you have to treat the land as though you don't own it because we should think of yourself as strangers to the land. So it makes sense to have a story which says you're not indigenous. That is, the indigenous wisdom of our indigenous people is you shouldn't think of yourself as indigenous. That's a great sin and a great problem. Okay.
And say there is no, that really what this adds up to is that there is no indigenous.
Yeah, but even if we don't go there, it still presents an interesting array of ideas. And it also says something about modern politics without saying like this is the way this or that should be. It says that if the Jewish people want to go back to the land and be living according to their indigenous wisdom, then what does it say about how the Jewish people have to treat the Palestinian people? Is that they're strangers to you, so you better love them because you're strangers. That's what it says. And it's pretty clear, right? So if you go in, here's a kind of a meta question. If you are an indigenous people going back to your land to which you are indigenous, and there are other people who may also be indigenous to that land, and you treat them the opposite of what your wisdom says you're supposed to do according to what it means to be indigenous in your civilization, does that make you not indigenous? Does it disrupt your indigeneity? Is it a failure of your indigenousness? Like, well, how do we measure it or what do we look at? What we do know is the Torah says if you do that and you go back and you don't follow your indigenous wisdom, you will go back into exile, that you won't deserve to be in the land. So regardless of how we put it in terms of indigenousness, if our covenant is real, which is the reason why we have a connection to this land, at least on a mythic or soul or fantasy level, depending on how you look at it, right? If we have this connection, it's contingent on us following this covenant, which says you can't act that way. So there are three promises about the land in the Torah. One is you can come into the land and inherit it if you strictly follow justice and love the land and love the people. Two, if you don't do that, you will get kicked out. And then the third promise is if after a long enough time you realize what you fucked up and fix it, then you get another chance to come back to the land. But if you mess it up again, you get kicked out again, right? So those are the three promises. They can keep going around like that. So we don't want to be in the cycle of the second promise. But that's where we seem to be right now, if you look at it and measure it according to the ethics of the Torah, is that we are, I'm not saying this about every person or about making a blanket statement about all of Zionism. There are many schools of Zionism and way of thinking about going back to the land. My ancestors were from Palestine, some of them. Like my great-grandfather came here from Palestine in 1910, right? There are Jews who are Palestinian in the same way that Palestinians are Palestinian. Some of the Jews are Palestinian that way. My family is, or at least that part of my family is, right? You can't erase that. But it's still true that if you behave like settler colonialists, which does happen in certain parts of Israel for sure, I think in a way that everyone could agree on, even though there might be debate about other places. That if our covenant is real, then that says we don't have that we've abused the right to be there. We do that. So that's kind of equivalent to saying you lose your indigenous, but it's not exactly because you can still get another chance later.
Where does it say you can go back? Where does it say you get another chance?
all of them Nevi'im.
Talk about that.
And in the end of Leviticus 26, actually there's a specific verse in Leviticus 26 that talks about this, which is worth looking at. And then we're at 1:30, so we're at 8:30, so we'll stop in a few minutes. I think we got most of the stuff out that is important to mention. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of what makes Palestinians indigenous, because we talked about understanding terrace and how to farm in the land. It's equally true, and maybe and in some ways more true, that Palestinian culture is exactly key to living in that land, ecologically, sustainably. And what do we mean by sustainably? It means you understand how to live just from that ecosystem for all of your needs. Your building, your farming, right, etc. You understand how to live in that land, and you can live in that land in a way that's sustainable. Palestinian culture, and I'm not talking about like the cities that are more, modern creations, but common Palestinian culture was very sustainable. Does have the kind of relationship to fruit trees, to the olive trees, that you would say are the mark of an indigenous culture, which we also have, right? We have so many strong laws about how you have to respect the fruit trees. But then what does it mean if we have laws that say literally in a time of war, you're not allowed to cut down a fruit tree? Literally, and then the IDF goes and tears up a bunch of olive trees. Or a settler goes and cuts down an olive tree or burns it. Like, this is exactly the opposite of what the Torah is teaching. On that front, there's no room for debate. Like, these people are completely violating what the covenant is about. And yet these people are the ones who claim to be like, I'm talking about settlers. And I'm not talking about all settlers, mind you. But there are some very violent settlers. A lot of them are very close to Nablus, which is where Shechem was, which is the place of violence from the Jewish ancestry, right? That's where some of the most violent settlers have settled. Yitzhar is an example. They think of themselves as going back to the land that they have a covenantal right to be in, and yet they do the exact opposite of what the covenant says. I don't understand what a person's brain is doing when they could possibly act that way. I don't even know how to have compassion or empathy with someone who
Act like that.
Honestly. And I have friends who are settlers who devote themselves to working with Palestinians in the West Bank to try to create peace, and who say they are willing to live in a Palestinian state because they love that land, and it's not about being Israeli land. Right? So there's other ways of being in relationship to that place. Right? Also, another meta issue. Do we want to talk about labels of Zionist, anti-Zionist, non-Zionist? Because I don't want to get into a big thing about it, but what I do want to say is this. Zionism used to mean a lot of different things, which included people who wanted a binational state. And I believe if I were enough like me and living back in the 20s, that I would have been in that camp. That's Martin Buber's camp. That's what he believed in. And then there are the Zionists who think you have to by force. There was Zionism said, you have to take it by force because there's no other way we're going to have it. So there's a very wide range of what Zionism means. But now it seems to have gotten narrower and narrower to mean mostly right-wing Zionism. And that's part of the problem, is that we can't have an intelligent conversation about it anymore because what it is has become so narrow in everyone's mind, and also in Jewish minds, because the left-wing Zionism is very weak right now. I mean, not any congregation in Israel, but in the world. So we're in a really precious, difficult moment, like an inflection point in history. Yeah, and this is, of course, true of climate change as well. Things are either going to go to total shit, or we're going to figure out a way to not act like this and live like this. And it's literally in our hands, in every person's hand, and there's no way to know what's going to happen. But it's clear to me that we have to take action.
That's on the side of
treating the stranger with love, treating the land like you don't own it. All these things that are core to our identity as a Jewish people, and core to ideas that are informing indigenous, and core to what it means to be in relationship to the divine, whatever the divine is. So I think we can figure out a way to do this. And the question is, can we get enough people on board in time? But that's the picture I want to lay out for you about indigenousness. There's a lot of ways to think about indigenousness. Some of them apply to the Jewish people. Some of them clearly apply to the Palestinian people. It's not about who's more indigenous. It's about how can my understanding of my indigenousness help me recognize your indigenousness and support you? And how can your indigenousness help you recognize what's indigenous about me and support me to create a different kind of world than the one we're in? So thank you for listening.
Yay,
And I'm happy to talk more and ask more and have more questions. But I appreciate you all coming very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, yeah. It's fabulous.
Lots of thank you.
Bye, everyone.